Welcome to the Stranded Technologies podcast. I'm your host and founder of Infinita Fund, Niklas Ansinger. In this show, we talk about how to accelerate the future. Our thesis is that many life-improving technologies are held back by institutional barriers. How can we unblock vast opportunities while mitigating against the risks? What ethical principles, rules, and regulations can guide us on that path? We will discuss these questions with entrepreneurs, policymakers, and industry experts. If you enjoy the show, please give us 5 stars and visit us at infinitafund.com to join the community. Today is October the 18th in 2022, and my guest is Storrs Hall, also known as Josh. Josh is an independent researcher and author. He was the founding Chief Scientist of Nanorex, which is developing a CAD system for nanomechanical engineering. His research interests include molecular nanotechnology and the design of useful macroscopic machines using the capabilities of molecular manufacturing. His background is in computer science, particularly parallel processor architectures, artificial intelligence. And Josh wrote an epic book called Where Is My Flying Car? A Memoir of Future Past. So this book will be the main topic of today's conversation. Josh might be the most requested guest for my show. I am based in the startup city of Prospera, and the book has a fan base here. It's all about what we want to fix. The book is basically the epitome of what I call stranded technologies on this podcast. But I didn't know about the book before I formulated the thesis. I read it and was like, wow, this is even deeper and further than I originally thought. So Josh is probably the world's foremost expert on stranded technologies. In fact, I could as well just stop the podcast and read excerpts from the book. So I couldn't be more excited to have this conversation. Josh, welcome to the show.
Why, thank you very much.
We're also joined by Trey Goff. Trey is the CMO of Prospera, the startup city in Honduras. Trey was the one who originally recommended the book to me, and I also had a conversation with him on episode 9 of this podcast. Trey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. It is an honor to be here. As I was saying off air previously, I think this is my favorite book of all time, and it's definitely my most often gifted book to friends. When they ask me what my ideology is, it's just this book.
This is something new for me. I've never realized I was an ideology creator.
Josh, besides what I said, what would you like listeners to know about you and your work?
This is actually my third book. I wrote a book about nanotechnology, and I wrote a book about robotics and AI. The robotics and AI book actually appeared to turn into what is now a smallish academic field, the field of AI alignment or AI safety. When I was working in AI over most of the latter part of the 20th century, I understood that one of the hardest things for the people then working to get right was the ability of the machine to use language. And one of the major advances, if you can think of philosophy as having advances, in the 20th century was that the ability of people to do ethical reasoning was very much like their ability to handle language. It was flexible in a way that simply had not ever been properly captured by lists of rules, which is the way that people were writing AI in those days. And so I said, well, if you're going to create an AI, a superintelligence in particular, that has not the ability to use language as well as it should, it's not going to be able to do ethics as well as it should either. And so we better start thinking about this. And the book was basically just opening the question and saying, let's start talking about this. And so that was my book, Beyond AI. And then the other one was nanotechnology, which is now in mainstream.
Wow, I think you can forget me for the next week while I devour these 2 books as well. Let's talk about the book, Where Is My Flying Car? The book is unusual. It starts as an examination of the technical limitations of building flying cars. Like, it's really about flying cars. It's just not just a title. And it evolves into an investigation of the scientific, technological, and social roots of the economic stagnation that started in the 1970s. How did your thinking evolve up to the point of the book? When or how did you realize that something is off, that the progress that everyone is talking about is not what it should or what it could be?
Well, one of the things that happened was that being in computer science, I got used to my field advancing at what would be considered a breakneck speed. I mean, you have Moore's Law and you have the advance in algorithms and the advance in processing power and the advance in computer architectures. And I was actually a little bitty part of that, of, inventing stuff. And I was actually retiring and taking stock of, how everything had gone and so forth. And I started putting some effort into nanotechnology, and I realized that it was just a lot harder than computer science had been, and not because it was dealing with physical stuff, although that also has something to do with it, but that there were countervailing forces out there, and what I ultimately wound up calling the Machiavelli effect. And I started sitting down and thinking about that and saying, if we want to solve all these huge, amazing problems that the world has with the huge, amazing possibilities of nanotechnology, we're going to have to find some way to allow it to progress as fast as computer science did. So I got to thinking, when whatever other technologies got held up the same way, now that I had personal experience in comparing two fields, one that really went for science and one that got stepped on, nanotechnology, I started looking around. And then the other thing was that in retirement, I became a keen flyer and got an airplane and got a pilot's license and started flying. And I was thinking, well, it's not really all that hard. People should have flying cars. I had to look and understand the same kind of thing had really happened in flying machines as well.
That's fascinating. So there were two major areas in your work there that you can compare and contrast: computer science and nanotechnology. So computer science advanced rapidly and nanotechnology was held back.
Yes. Of course, once I really got into it, and a major discovery I made during the writing of the book was the extent to which energy was the key enabler that really got stepped on the most, and that what I had called the Henry Adams curve, where more and more energy to do all the things that we wanted to do up to the 70s, and then it just flatlined. When I made up that graph of, which you'll find in the book, of the technologies versus the 1960s era predictions for the technologies, there was just a clear cutoff that depended on the amount of energy the technology needed to use. And I expected to find something of a correlation, which is why I into the trouble of making that graph and working out those numbers in the first place. But for a sharp line like that, I was actually quite surprised.
To add on to that and to ask you a question about that as well, there's this fabulous website. The URL is WTFhappenedin1971.com. And it's just a compilation of like 40 graphs of a bunch of macro trends that all started nosediving or plateauing in 1971 specifically. Everything from the dislocation of productivity from GDP per capita to the differential returns from labor versus capital to things that are kind of very downstream of those things that we wouldn't even think are correlated, like the use of polysyllabic terms in political speeches plummeted starting in 1971. The homeownership rate plummeted. The median home price skyrocketed. And they all have these very clear disjunctures in 1971, as does the energy auction that you mentioned as well. What do you think happened in 1971 that caused this effective plateau of, to put a broad gloss on it, a plateau of real, substantial, like material human progress in a way?
I think actually it wasn't a specific thing that happened in 1971. I think that what happened was that a whole bunch of trends culminated and came together in some sort of social wave action process, like a perfect storm. And but I do think that that is quite a reasonable thing to have happened, considering how many trends were building up to the point when they all came together in one time, place, and so forth, that the effects just sort of overwhelmed what would have been the normal resources and defenses of society.
And also to train our listeners' intuition a bit again, because not everyone might be as familiar with this as we are. So what Trey just described, what the fuck happened in 1971, is often called the Great Stagnation by economists. So Tyler Cowen, for example, Robert J. Gordon, sometimes Peter Thiel, and Josh in his book is talking about this Great Stagnation, which is very counterintuitive, right? But the basic observation is that the period from 1880 to 1940 brought numerous major technological advances in our life, like electricity, powerful motors, automobiles, airplanes, household appliances, indoor plumbing, the telephones, you name it. The list goes on and on. And in contrast, starting in the 70s, brought seemingly only really the internet. But other than that, our lives are pretty much the same as they were in 1953.
If there was a single thing that happened right then, it was that exponentially increasing amount of energy that we had per capita suddenly flatlined. And since the 70s, we're still using the same, or actually somewhat less. It's gone slightly down since.
What role do you think public policy played in this? And I'm working with Prospera, I spent a lot of time working on public policy and trying to craft the most effective public policy environment for catalyzing innovation and for solving this stagnation effectively. What role do you think, in particular, the kind of snowballing of laws and regulation and permitting processes and licensing, et cetera, played on this? And in particular, do you think that has played a role on not just the innovation in these sectors, but also on new firm creation in these sectors? So I like to think of this in terms of Bastiat, who's one of my favorite political economists, the seen and the unseen, right? We have the seen cost of the regulation, making it directly harder to innovate. But we also have the unseen cost of entrepreneurs who would have made advances in, say, nanotechnology and flying cars, et cetera, but didn't even bother trying because the mass of the federal regulatory code and other legal barriers in the way of doing what they wanted to do were so great, they said, oh, why bother? It's not even going to be possible because the state won't let me effectively. So that is my personal hobby horse on this, but I'm very curious what role you think that played in this flatlining.
Right, a few miles on that hobby horse. In particular, the one set of advances we thought was going to be the third wave in energy production, which was nuclear, just got completely clobbered. Not only did you have the normal sort of regulatory red tape and slowdown and so forth, but we got an NRC that was actively anti-nuclear and just set out to strangle as many people as possible. And it was, like I say, it wasn't just business as usual red tape. It was activism against the whole area that they were supposed to be regulating. That's probably the worst. That's really the case where public policy has got completely turned against progress in its field. I think you have a few things that allowed that to happen. If you go back and look at the history of through the 50s, people got bigger and bigger cars and things were cool, and it was a status symbol to have a big car. And then the 60s were an area of turmoil, and you got big cars, but you also got little cars, and it's not all regulation either. The big three automakers in the United States just got so arrogant and sure of themselves, they started making cars that would fall apart in a couple of years. And the Japanese came in with these dinky little cars, but the difference was they were much higher quality than the Detroit cars. And that's how they actually got a toe in the door. The Japanese car industry kind of took over. And if you want to see two cases where it looks like pieces of America have been just bombed, okay, you can find two of them. You go to the Bronx, where there's been rent control for decades and decades, and you go to Detroit, where what used to be the great factories of American car making, like they've been bombed out too. I mean, it's almost sick to see, but if you just want to steep yourself in angst at some point, have a look at those.
Just add one more point on that. There's this fantastic book called The Sack of Detroit by Kenneth White that I read a few months ago that goes into great detail on this. And it is indeed the U.S. automakers, they were over 30% of aggregate U.S. GDP by that point. It were like by far the massive proportion of the U.S. economy in the 1950s. And they got utterly complacent and were outcompeted by the Japanese. But when they tried to compete with the Japanese, Ralph Nader came along and effectively nuked the industry single-handedly because he was an ardent anti-capitalist. So I would definitely recommend readers check out The Sack of Detroit as well. But even example, I agree with you. Part of that was indeed missteps by American industry. But a big part of that was also this push for safety regulations that result in what we see today, which are bigger cars that are all fairly homogeneous because federal government regulates down to the detail of the inches of bumper you can have, degrees of curvature versus sharpness you can have on corners of cars. I mean, everything. The reason cars all look roughly the same today is precisely because of that U.S. regulatory environment. So
I have an appendix in my original version of the book that it's basically just a section from the car regulation. It had to do with rear view mirrors or something like that. And it was because this turns out to have been one of the things that was getting in the way of people making flying cars, because airplanes don't have rear view mirrors for obvious reasons. They're air brakes. What you would like in an airplane is a rear view camera that you can use and not have some giant thing sticking out into your airstream and wasting energy. But NHTSA or whoever it is that regulates these things, and unfortunately there are too many regulatory bodies for me to actually even know who they all are. has not allowed people trying to make convertible car airplanes to do that.
Another example of this, of how they're stymieing progress in transportation as well, is in drone technology. The FAA has effectively just declared war on the entire drone industry. It's next to impossible to make passenger drones. They stopped. Amazon had a great plan to make a fleet of drones that could carry up to 10 kilograms apiece to deliver packages in 30 minutes or less around the U.S. The FAA put the kibosh on that entirely. So it's not just the NHTSA, it's also basically every federal regulator is just captured by activists who actively despise the industries in which they're regulating. The FAA is another example of that, and it's why we also don't have flying drone taxis, is the exact same reason.
Or just flying drone pizza delivery, for that matter. I mean, something that light, they ought to just let it run. And if not, they should just say, okay, anybody in Nevada can fly anything they want anywhere. And there's not going to be all that much somebody builds a machine that crashes and messes up its pizza. That's how we got aviation in the first place. Why does it have to be a complete ban on experimentation like that? It speaks to the psychological and philosophical standpoint of the regulators, as opposed to what ought to be a reasonable and rational standpoint of somebody who is actually trying to advance the society's capability and make a better world for the future.
This fits into my kind of hobby horse about regulation stymieing innovation, and the potentials to be unlocked here are immediately obvious. One of the first firms we've had set up in Prospera is called Aerial Loop. It's a Latin American drone company, and they do like commercial drone deliveries. Their drones can carry up to 5 kilograms, and they've already set up in the Prospera Zete and are running drone flights to other parts of the island in between the connected hubs. We have one on the Roatan and one on the mainland in La Ceiba. And it's just a perfect example of, yes, to your point, like having a regulatory environment that exists to not stand in opposition to innovators and entrepreneurs, but to enable them while still ensuring public safety is not that hard to do, and enables an immediate step change increase in the type of technology available for consumers and the lived experience of those consumers. This is another area where, yeah, not to toot Prospera's horn alone, but I mean, there's so many low-hanging fruit that have yet to be picked because the regulatory state effectively stands in the way. And I think it's primarily because of an ideology I call safetyism. I don't know if it has an actual name, but effectively the heuristic for the regulators did not become, we should stop worst case scenarios and let innovation flourish otherwise. The heuristic is instead, if anything can possibly be construed to possibly have even the tiniest infinitesimal amount of risk to someone somewhere, it must be ex ante stopped and made illegal until you can prove the safety otherwise. It's the default of safetyism is precisely the opposite of what it should be to encourage innovation while still maintaining a healthy balance of public safety.
I talk about in the book under the subheading of speed limit 1, where they're doing that very harshly in the case of anything having to do with radiation. I have a fun story. I don't think it got into the book, but Cousins is a physicist at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and they have there a gram of radium that had been given to the National Bureau of Standards by Marie Curie back in the 20s. She discovered it, and they had taken up a collection to give the United States this princely gift of a gram of radium for research purposes. And the National Bureau / Institute has had this ever since. And it's getting harder and harder for them to hang on to it because the NRC is trying to make them get rid of it because it's radioactive. It's insane. It really is. And the one that actually did make it into the book is the very first sample of plutonium that was developed during the Second World War by the use of accelerators. And it was the first piece of a brand new element that mankind had ever made. And they're having a whole lot of trouble trying to hang on to that, even though it's a vastly important historical artifact for the same reason.
Yeah, my favorite data point on this, to your point earlier, is that the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was set up for the express purpose of approving new nuclear reactors, new nuclear power stations in the United States, has not, since it was created in, I think, 1975 or 1971, one of the two, has not approved a single application for a new nuclear power station in the U.S. Not one. Just a perfect example of what you're talking about. It's not like we're saying, oh, they're only approving 100 and they should be approving 1,000, although that would be preferable. They're approving 0.
That particular point is fairly well made and understood. The thing that was of interest to me was how many examples there are that you have a whole ecology of technologies that enable each other. And one of the key things I was doing was channeling Arthur Clarke and trying to look at what future technology would be like And one of the ways of looking at a stagnation is to measure the distance between where you are and where you might have been. And where you might have been is essentially a physical technology that's advanced to the same extent that our computing and communications technology has. And you just sit there and think about that for a minute. What if your car or your airplane, or what if you had a gadget sitting on your desk that could do as many physical things as your iPhone can do, informational and computational ones? If you want to get one simple example, it turns out that in the world of competition chess, there's a joke that people say. The joke goes, well, my iPhone can beat the world chess champion. And the other guy says, well, toaster can beat the world chess champion. And the fact is that it's a joke because your toaster can't beat the world chess champion, but your iPhone can. It's just incredible. IBM had to build a special machine back in the 90s to beat the world chess champion. But nowadays, you have it in your pocket, that much computation and that much accumulated knowledge in the program, the algorithmic advances as well. But that's the sort of thing that you ought to have in physical technology as well, and we just don't.
So looking back, it seems the internet and communication technology was the only of many technologies that we could have had, that how our future could have looked like. And it seemed also in the internet there was a history where that was not always clear. Like the regulator could have potentially also said no. There were some inflection points in the history of the internet. And just to drive the point home about regulation, right? So yes, in the beginning of a new technology, things are unsafe and there's fraud, there's porn, there's scams in the internet, right? But over time it gets better, it gets safer. Right, and we wouldn't want to live in a world without the internet, I hope we recognize now. But the regulators commanding the safety features from what would be effectively year 10 in year 1. You need the safety that is not possible, thereby blocking it in its infancy before it can become something that's living up to its promise or benefits.
I think not only are the regulators just simply overdoing it, I think that part of the problem is that they're just responding to the wrong incentives. And I'll point you to a case where regulation completely failed, and that was gain-of-function experiments on viruses. It just recently came out. Somebody published a paper that they're still doing gain-of-function experiments, and they're still adding nasty bits to the Omicron variant of COVID on purpose. And you look at that and you say, what? How could they do that? And the thing is that the place they should have been regulating, the people they should have been saying, oh, you really shouldn't be doing that, they were hiding the fact that they were doing it and that they were allowing, and in fact, the so-called regulators were actually solely funding it in some cases. And I don't think anybody knows the whole story, but I think there's enough information out there that you can say that this is absolutely a case of regulatory failure. Instead, what they're doing is keeping me from flying an ultralight, out over Chesapeake Bay, just to see what I can make it do. So it's a little silly.
The exact paper you're referencing, I've read this morning, actually, so it's funny timing. Team at Boston University, even though we just had a global pandemic because of what is in all likelihood a laboratory escape of gain-of-function research, a team at Boston University, a very crowded city in the United States, just did some research where they modified the spike protein of the Omicron COVID virus to give it an 80% more fatality rate in mice. 80%. That's the type of gain-of-function research they are still doing. So this is a perfect example of just raw regulatory failure, again, because of misaligned incentives amongst the people doing the regulating.
So I want to quickly summarize the thesis of the book and what you just described, and then talk about a couple of other interesting areas of technology where you basically tell the history of why it's not the way it could be. The explanation for what we called the Great Stagnation has to do with energy. So what you called before the Henry Adams curve basically describes the process of an increasing amount of energy usage that goes hand in hand with technological progress. And then in the 1970s, a decline or stagnation of energy usage, right? And a key piece to the story of that is nuclear power. The fact that nuclear power has been outregulated, even though it has massive and huge potential. In one way, how you describe effects on technology and on progress, you were basically looking at predictions of future technologies by science fiction writers, what we will have in the future, and you graphed them by the ones that were relatively more and less dependent on energy intensity and energy use. And you basically found that we got all the ones that require little use of energy, and we got none of the ones that had high use of energy.
So, yes, that's absolutely right. I was even surprised myself when it came out that way. There was a stark cutoff line.
Talk about a couple of these technologies that are in there. I have a list of technologies that I would love to name and to go through, and you can talk a bit what the possibilities there are and where it could be today if we had continued on the trajectory we had before. But you can also pick your own that you're most excited about. But we could start with nanotechnology.
Nanotechnology is one of the ones that it stands about halfway in between the good stuff like computers and communication and so forth, the bad stuff like nuclear. And the reason that nanotechnology got held up was almost entirely due to the fact that the government decided to fund it in a typically politically sleazy way in the United States. And I don't think the other countries suffered that much of a backlash to it, but seeing what was happening to the nanotechnology researchers in the U.S. Might have had influence on them. And I've been able to talk to some of the guys in various other countries and said, now that can't be happening. And then they come to the U.S. and lo and behold, well, yeah, I guess maybe it is happening. And what happened was that if you followed Eric Drexler's original scheme for building machines at the nanoscale, or you tried to follow Feynman's idea of building smaller machines, all of which you knew how to build, as long as you work out the techniques for improving your precision as you go along, then we should have had nanotechnology in its complete and utter form of the ability to create anything that physics allows to exist on the atomic scale by now. We should have had. The reason it didn't was that in the 90s, Science Foundation and so forth, the people in charge of the funding realized that the National Nanotechnology Initiative did not provide a whole new $500 million for nanotechnology research. It stole $500 million for nanotechnology research from all these other areas. And so everybody in those affected areas kind of got up in arms, and there was a political wave backlash. And what they did was, they stole the term nanotechnology. And so what's called nanotechnology research now bears very little resemblance to the original concept was. And what they did was just they took everything they were doing that could be measured in nanometers and called it nanotechnology. I don't want to say too much about it because all of that was good scientific research. And all the people were doing was defending their own funding as well as they could. But if you tried to do that, and particularly if you attached activity to a concept, that concept's going to get squashed. So it's not only a natural human thing, it's a natural human thing that was written about in detail 500 years ago by Niccolo Machiavelli. It would have been expected, but of course it wasn't, because that's just the way these things work. But that's what happened to nanotechnology. What's happened is that the focused area got crushed, but progress towards finer mechanical control and the ability to manipulate molecules and the science of the area and all that sort of stuff is still going on. It's just not going on in a focused way that would have allowed us to have nanotech now. But I think that we're probably going to have it in the next decade or two. And that's going to enable an enormous amount of stuff of the kind that I'm talking about, including flying cars that are powerful and quiet and can fly themselves, and so forth. I think that a good way of looking at what the future of technology could be like is to take three areas. You have the one that's going great guns right now, the artificial intelligence and computing. You take the one that is getting there, but not as fast as it could be, which is nanotechnology, and then you have nuclear and energy. And if you put those three together, you have what I was calling the second atomic age, where the ability not only to make these incredible machines, but to power them comes back around to the sort of thing that people expected in 1960.
So one of the arguments I have seen, and this is not what the regulator said, to be clear, But one of the arguments I have seen against the experimental approach and the kind of more freewheeling approach to developing nanotechnology is this existential risk that some people talk about. They call the gray goo. The idea is if we gain the ability to arbitrarily arrange molecules effectively through tiny self-replicating machines on the nanoscale, that if these are unleashed on the environment and are able to arbitrarily convert other matter into themselves, basically because they're self-replicating and they can arbitrarily organize molecules, that this turns into this ever-expanding gray goo that you effectively can't stop because it's just converting all available matter into more copies of itself, basically. Obviously, I don't think this is the case, and I'm very bullish on nanotech, but I wanted to steelman the existential risk argument against this. How do you respond to that charge? Because I've brought this up to friends before, the nanotech point in particular, and they're like, because if you just let people experiment with nanotech, they'll kill us all, basically.
Well, I don't think that's actually a serious problem. I think that it would be possible to invent, once we had a lot of experience with nanotech, machines that would be pretty nasty to have around. But I don't think they're going to be the result of haphazard experimental problems. I think they're going to be people setting out to build nasty machines. Okay, everybody worries about recombinant DNA, biotech, all that sort of stuff. And then you turn around and say, oh, well, this pandemic was because of people specifically trying to build nasty gadgets. Well, I think that people specifically trying to build nasty gadgets is something you have to look out for, but that's also the case in any powerful technology. And my take on it, which I explore to some extent in my nanotechnology book, which you might be interested in reading, is that the best defense against that kind of thing is to have a general level of technology understanding and preparedness that is higher than the single evil scientist on his island, rather than trying to prevent there being any research whatsoever. So I think that at a general level of good guys with powerful machines is a much better defense against one or two bad guys with powerful machines than trying to prevent there being powerful machines.
You mentioned something before in the nanotechnology story, the Machiavelli effect, and I think it was such a brilliant way to understand basically politics. So I'm going to give the Machiavelli quote in full. It's from Niccolo Machiavelli, the Prince, from 1532. There's nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new conditions. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men, who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience in them. Thus it happens that whatever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it like partisans, whilst the others defend lukewarmly, in such wise that the prince is endangered along with them. So I think that's also something that describes the journey of almost any entrepreneur that's bringing out something new into the world. And it just shows what you're up against. And this also shows the deep feature of human nature that Machiavelli observed that 500 years ago.
This is one of my favorite quotes in all the world, and thank you for reading it. Machiavelli wrote this, and it was absolutely true. But he wrote this during the Renaissance, which was a period of rapid innovation and great social advance. So it's not a death sentence. It's just a roadblock, something you can get around, you can go over, you can, if absolutely necessary, bust up. But even though it was true to the extent that he wrote about it in the book when he was there, it wasn't the reigning dynamic of his age.
That reminded me often when I talk to founders, like when I talk too much about the things that are messed up and regulation holding things back, they're like, yeah, so what? Let's not complain. Let's do things. Let's get it done. Let's get around it, which is the exact correct attitude. And I just love it. But that was kind of the point about nanotechnology, that it was held back on political obstacles and infighting because of the public science funding. That might be a hint to entrepreneurs out there. I've talked on this podcast a couple of times about decentralized science, right? So alternative ways to fund basic research. So we're seeing it already, for example, in biotechnology. So companies like VidaDAO, they're sourcing from a network often of people who Vitalik Buterin, people who are big and have made money in crypto, and basically fund basic science through DAOs without going through any centralized organization. So that seems to be the correct learning from the mistake of that have been made in nanotechnology, right? That you have a greater variety and competition for science funding.
Well, I think ultimately it's going to happen in nanotechnology is going to be the same thing that's happened in AI over about the past-ish years. Not to break my arm patting myself on the back, but I predicted that 10 years before that in the AI book. And I was writing in criticism of the people who said, oh, we're going to build an AI that's going to be so smart that it's going to improve itself. And all of a sudden, we're going to have this infinitely intelligent creature that's going to take over the world and do all these horrible things. I said, that's not the way it's going to happen. What's going to happen is right now, there's a cadre of cool kids who think that AI is going to be the next great thing. And they've been working on it, and they can't even agree on how to do it, and they can't agree on how it's going to work, and so forth. And I was in that. I was an AI for a lot of my career. And so I said, what's actually going to happen is that at some point, some of the stuff is actually just going to start working. Somebody's going to have just enough good ideas to put something together that does something notably better than the other way of doing it. And then the money is going to start to flow into the field. And so the people who are doing this are going to be able to hire new smart people to do this as opposed to something else. The self-organization that takes place in a market is going to concentrate resources and brains into the people doing AI. And that's exactly what happened. You know, technology is just waiting for that moment where somebody starts getting molecular machines working not to the point where they can make a cutesy press release and article in the science press, but something that's obviously better than the other way of doing it or whatever other way we have. And people are going to start saying, oh, wow, I better get into this or lose my shirt. The money is going to start flowing into nanotech. And if I had to guess, I'd say around 2030, maybe the same kind of sudden bloom of techniques and resources and ideas and the explosion of papers and people talking about it works is going to happen in nanotech the same way it did in AI. And that'll be number 2 in my 3 technologies.
I wanted to ask about this or talk about this more a bit later, but just to make a note that you and also Trey and I, we're fundamentally optimists, right? So we're not pointing out all these problems with technology, all these bad things that happen and hold it back. We're fundamentally doing it basically to try to overcome it and, create a better future. That said, let's talk a bit more about other areas of technology where you say in the book we could have made much more advances. Again, in no particular order, but what I'd also be interested in to talk about is genetics and AI, biotechnology, cold fusion, space travel. Which ones would you like to talk about?
Let's talk about AI. I think it's pretty clear now, especially to anyone in the investing world, but anybody in the technological world too, that AI has passed a threshold, and we're suddenly in an era where we can expect the capabilities of AI just to get better and better at a very steady rate, if not an increasing rate, as time goes on. And I would say 2030 by the point. And in this case, I think that's a far limit, that we're going to have machines that you can't, from a person, not that you cared. You call up in a call center and you don't get someone who's been given 3 minutes of training and sit in a chair. You get a machine that actually knows absolutely everything you need to know and need to do. And lots of other jobs like that are going to start being done capably. And that's just going to have a general beneficial effect. I hesitate to say, because the reasons that our political and regulatory system are so bad are not really that we don't know how to do it better. It's that there are lots of other reasons that they're not being done right. But it may well be the case that somebody somewhere tries using an AI as a regulator, or in fact as a whole government. And this is by far from a done deal or necessarily going to work. But the more people try it, somebody's going to start getting it better and better. And after a while, people are going to realize that you really don't want to have a bunch of random politicians running your life. You want to have some machine that is super competent running your life instead. There's at least grounds for some kind of optimism on that scale. So that's one of the reasons I think that we're going to be able to, as the human race, handle having very powerful technologies, because one of them is going to be the science of governing properly and putting the technology we have to the best uses. That's AI. I mean, I want Rosie, the robot, to be cleaning up my house. I also want a robot doctor operating on me who doesn't get tired and knows absolutely everything in the medical journals and so forth. And ultimately, the really critical things are going to be done by AI simply because they'll be doing them better than humans. So what does that leave for us to do? What's what we got to figure out? It's definitely something worth working on, isn't it? You have all the resources you could possibly want. What would you do? How can you make things better for yourself or for everyone else? So to change subjects, let's colonize the solar system. Let's get out there so that the next 6-mile asteroid doesn't knock out all life on Earth the way it did 63 million years ago. Let's do a whole bunch of other cool stuff like that we'll be able to do because we will have the competent helpers who will be able to do what we would consider magic technology. The situation of the human race will be, okay, let's figure out what the really good things that we can do, that we need to do, or that we would like to do, and do them. So here you have AI and you have space travel. You asked about cold fusion. I talk about cold fusion in the book. I think that's one of the more likely ways of getting into using nuclear energy as a replacement for fossil fuels. There was a famous bunch of experiments starting in 1989 where some researchers at Utah and then a whole bunch of other people began to show that they could get more heat out of electrolytic experiments involving deuterium and palladium than physics could explain. And they thought it was due to fusion. And the problem is that physics, as everybody understood it then, and in fact, physics as everybody understands it now, says that can't happen. And yet, here we had experiments that were showing that you could, in fact, get excess heat out of these experiments, and they've been replicated hundreds and hundreds of times since then. Question is, what really is going on in there? And that's what we need nanotechnology to do, because something's going on at the molecular level, at the atomic level, that produces some configuration of atoms. If we had nanotechnology, we can investigate that. We could do control experiments and actually set up exactly the sort of molecular relations that people are thinking might be causing this. And we could figure out which one really does it, and then we'd be able to figure out why. And design new machines that did it better and that kind of thing. Because doing it the way we know how to do it, which is to build a gigantic heap of uranium and let it get hot, is kind of almost medieval in his character.
To give a shout out to the crew over at Oklo, nuclear power company. They have already taken a step in that direction. The NRC is the only thing standing in their way. Their reactor, they have a modular reactor set up, one of which can put out up to 15 megawatts that fits into the size of a small building, but the size of an A-frame house, roughly. And it is inherently safe. They're buried in the ground. They use molten sodium, which means the fluid dynamics of the system itself makes it such that it is like a physical impossibility by the laws of physics for the thing to overheat because of the melting capacity, the melting temperature of sodium. And these things already exist, as unfortunately being held up by the same Machiavellian forces we've been discussing this whole time. So I bring that up just to drive home, like, the things Josh is saying for the audience are not like pie in the sky dreaming. Many of them already exist and are well away if only the political actors would get out of the way and let them happen.
Yep, I think you're basically right there.
So biotechnology, if we had gotten the rate of progress that we're talking about, if we'd gotten progress in nuclear and energy usage and nanotechnology, what could we do in the area of biotechnology?
I think we're probably within a decade of some breakthroughs on things like anti-aging and anti-cancer research and the sort of thing that everybody's been saying, well, Einstein can cure cancer. The fact is that we're actually getting to that, and that is one of the technologies that has not been held up as much because it's a low energy technology. You have people like Coach walking around labs carrying test tubes, and it just doesn't look as dangerous as it actually is. And so you don't have the sort of backlash against it because they all say, we're trying to cure cancer. And everybody says, go for it. So biotechnology is probably advanced at roughly the rate you could have expected back in the 60s.
More in the area of the science and not in the area of commercializing a lot of these great innovations. In that area, we have the problem of the FDA. That's basically saying anything that goes to market has to be tested for 10 to 15 years and costs hundreds of millions, right?
Yes, you do have that. You have the anything that can be classed as anything even vaguely medical gets really restricted. And I would personally like somebody to find a way to get around that because I'm not getting any younger here. I talked a little bit about things like RNA vaccines and so forth, which is sort of out of nowhere, but and it used a whole bunch of different technologies, including micromachining. That sort of thing gets really enhanced by computing because you can do molecular simulations of nanotechnology because you're able to get closer to the actual processes and control what's going on and build things perhaps that you couldn't have built otherwise and so forth. So I think that we're on the threshold of a fairly major golden age in biotechnology as well, as long as they don't start, making nastier viruses.
And I can actually give a concrete example of an area where the regulatory environment and the FDA is holding up progress in biotech and in things like longevity treatment. I can do it by way of example in Prospera. There is a biotech startup in Prospera called MiniCircle. It's currently doing a distributed clinical trial based out of Prospera of a drug called follistatin. It's a follistatin MiniCircle gene therapy. And I won't go into the details of exactly how it works, but it's a fairly efficacious anti-aging treatment. It increases muscle mass, bone density. It can decrease adiposity, which is just a fancy way of saying decrease body fat, basically. All things that have strong correlations with biological aging. And the reason that they set up in Prospera was precisely because they could legally and under a safe and reasonable regulatory environment do that treatment within the jurisdiction, whereas they could not do it basically anywhere else in the world. Not because it's dangerous. It's not. In fact, during the regulatory review process in Prospera, where we audited their technology, we had a PhD molecular biologist review it, and we couldn't find a single way that it could even be construed as possibly being dangerous. So of course they could do it. A reasonable regulator should. So I am sure there are a million more examples like that in the world, but just to give one concrete example, and shout out to my friend Mac Davis, runs a MiniCircle there in Prospera. It's just an example of the things that are possible right now, if only these regulators would effectively get out of the way.
Fantastic. Faster, please.
I want to, in the same vein, talk finally about the actual flying car. What is kind of the history of the flying car, the technical limitations, and what's been holding it back? Where's my flying car? Where is it? Why is it not here yet?
As I typically say in interviews, people say, well, when are we going to get the flying car? And I say, basically, as soon as we want them. This is one of the things I set out to understand when I was writing the book. It included buying an airplane and becoming a pilot and trying to have not only a fixed-wing airplane, but a gyrocopter. And it's that you'd think that with all this falderall, it would be a hard thing to fly an airplane. It's not really. It is not as easy as driving a ground car. And there are some people that I see driving ground cars that I wouldn't want to see flying a flying car. But for the average Joe, I think he would be a perfectly pilot, especially with the sort of autopilots that we can make nowadays with the electronics and the sensor capabilities that we have and so forth. I think that basically you're going to be able to get into a machine and say, let's go here, and move your hand around on an iPad-like surface or something and say, okay, here's the route, or here's what I want to do, or whatever. You should be able to do that. In fact, today my wife and I just went up to visit a phone store that was about 40 minutes away, and I was calculating, okay, if we had a flying car that was nothing better than a helicopter, we could have gotten there in less than 15 minutes and saved ourselves a little time. It would have been a cooler drive too. So anyway, we have the technology now. If we had not fallen off the Henry Adams curve and had the great stagnation, there are a lot of people who could afford something that was essentially like a current day helicopter. I mean, that we can improve it as far as speed is concerned. We can improve it as far as noise is concerned. We can even improve it as far as how much space you need to land is concerned. But the fact is that since the 1930s, we've had things that were perfectly usable flying cars available technologically. And the fact that they haven't come down in price the way most significant technologies have done. The fact that have been regulatorily oppressed is a function of why we didn't, as a society, didn't want to have them. So my answer again is we'll get them when we want them, pretty much as soon as we do want them, because the technology is there. And it took me a while just to get over the point of saying, okay, when everybody who's a techie or a nerd approaches the subject seems to have the same idea. Okay, I'm going to invent the one thing that's standing between us and the flying car. There's nothing standing between us and the flying car except the regulation and the fact that people just don't seem to care.
Yeah, you also mentioned in your book the liability crisis of the 1980s and the traffic control systems.
It's a piece of history that is very germane to the subject. The liability revolution in the 70s completely destroyed the light aircraft, and all the companies that used to be, every single one of them either reorganized or just went bust. And then Congress noticed that, oh, we've completely destroyed an industry. You could have an airplane. You got into the airplane, you were drunk, you flew into somebody's house. The plane was 40 years old. The survivors of the crash could still sue the manufacturer. I mean, that's insane. But that's the level to which this sort of idiocy had gone. Yes, the liability revolution, which basically allowed anybody to sue anybody with deep pockets, is a major factor in killing off the light aircraft industry. I really don't know what to do about that, because people just seem to like to be able to sue people, and just need a new way of thinking about what's nice and what's not nice.
Yeah, I wonder if Machiavelli said anything about people suing each other.
I think back in his day, they were a little more straightforward about it, and they just went out with a sword.
There's one last piece of stranded technology that I'd like you to talk about, because it's so close to what Trey is doing at Prospera, which is cities, right? So you're describing in the book how cities could look very different. They could be multi-level, multi-lane highways. They could be on the sea. They could be domed. They could be aerostats.
The city ought to be a really cool place to live. I think that somehow or other the notion of how you run a city has just been forgotten. There are social and political forces that have taken over aspects of governance that make a city as a unified technology one of our most poorly performing technology. How do I build a functioning city? I say, look at the Jetsons. I put 250 people in that sky apartment sort of thing they had, and then have to get in your flying car to get to the next one, and just spread it out all over Arizona or something. And that would be my first guess. But if you're going to build a city that is just going to be like one giant structure where every human-made thing is touching every other human-made thing, which is the case in our, don't make it so that the only way to get from point A to point B is driving on the same ground surface that was there before you built the buildings. Have an integrated, pre-designed transportation infrastructure so you can get from any point to any other point in the city much faster than you could have done. The key thing about a city is the ease of getting from point A to point B. And if you can't do that, why the hell have a city? If you're going to design a city of the future and some billionaire who just wants to have a go at it, look at the transportation infrastructure first, and then do everything else that based on what you've come up with.
If you want to talk a bit more about space travel that we haven't talked that much about yet.
Within a couple of months, before the end of this year, you're going to have the 50th anniversary of the very last footprint on the moon. Okay, that was 50 years ago, and we haven't gone back. A whole bunch of people are saying we should redo our entire energy infrastructure, and they're worried about things like climate change and pollution and who knows what else. And I would say to these people, look at the moon, because 50 years ago, we could do things like that. NASA have spent as much money and as much time as it took us to go to the moon from a standing start to do it again, and have not succeeded yet. Okay? Our crufty, aging governance, societal structures are incapable of building things the way they did 50 years ago. And so don't think about trying to redo our energy infrastructure until you get a society that's actually able to build things like that. It's my parting shot.
Great. I want to move on to discuss culture, right? So what are the Eloi in your terminology? And what role do they play in our contemporary culture?
Eloi were the remains of humanity, and H.G. Wells's essentially seminal science fiction novel, The Time Machine. He imagined that for centuries and centuries, or even millennia, the human race is going to have lived in a civilized state where you didn't have to fight, you didn't have to toil. We had made machines and had laws of police, so basically everybody was safe all the time, and so there was no reason to have all of what he considered the manly characteristics to life wasn't hard. And so people got soft. And the Eloi were the result of this. They were essentially childlike descendants of humanity. And so his time traveler gets there, and they're all like little kids. And they're not only small and weak, but they are timid and stupid. Okay, so this is what he imagines humanity becoming after having been coddled by its technology for all of these millennia or so forth. I looked at what's going on in the stagnation and so forth, saying, one of the reasons that we're getting this is because people are actually kind of following that path. And the only thing that would have surprised H.G. Wells is that it only took 1 century for it to happen. And I really don't know the extent to which this, as opposed to all the other forces that we've been talking about, the reason. I think it's just like I said, but to begin with, a perfect storm. That there's a whole bunch of things that came together, but that's one of them. We don't really have to go out and conquer nature. We don't have to really go out and conquer distance. We don't have to really go out and conquer space. We don't need energy because we're all getting timider and stupider and weaker and so forth. And that's the way we are, and that's the way we like it. Well, I can say is I don't like it.
Yeah. To contrast that, or to poke a bit of hole in that, so at one point in the book you have this quote, which I love: "Unlike a century ago, today, for everyone who's working on advancing technological progress, there's someone else who fervently believes that they are saving the planet by stopping them."
Stopping
right?
it, yes.
So isn't it? Mm-hmm. So isn't it that people are just passionate just about stopping progress, or not just enjoying the fruits of it?
Yes. Well, this is why I proceeded to coin the phrase the Eloi agonistes. That in Wells's book, he has the human race declining on an evolutionary timescale, and so the people actually are smaller and weaker and stupider and so forth. What's happened in our case is that's happened essentially in the culture and not physically. So we're actually the same kind of people that we were 100 years ago as far as individuals are concerned. It's that the culture kind of wants to be like the Eloi. And so the individual has the same drives, if nothing else, be useful, because we actually each have somewhere and to some extent an instinct to want to be a useful part of our communities and our society and our culture. And so if that's all you have, one of the easiest ways to think that you're doing good is to look around and see something that seems dangerous to you. And the easiest thing to think is dangerous is something that's powerful. And you have to realize that this is how evolution works. Nobody does this for a reason. There is a process of variation that is random. So anything that is going to fit into your psychological niche to be useful, somebody's going to do it simply because variation is random. And in the absence of a selection mechanism, which the hard life of our ancestors provided, in the absence of that, all this variation is just going to get out there and go. And you could come up with all sorts of other theories, but this was my thought of, we have all this variation going on and nothing is selected. And so we have all these people who think by stopping nuclear power, for example, they're saving the world because it's big and powerful and they don't understand it. and in particular, they didn't realize it's really the safest way of generating power. But in fact, there's a huge number of people that, especially after you were talking about Nader, after the Nader groups in the 1960s had their go at nuclear power for a decade, 2/3 of the people in the United States believed that a nuclear power plant could go off like a nuclear bomb, which is, of course, idiotic. But the fact is that that's the belief that had been spread to the point that this became one of the key reasons for the backlash against nuclear power. It's a process of variation unconstrained by selection. And I think that is the dynamic that gave rise to the Eloi agonistes.
I think that's exactly right. I love the way you phrased that. And I think there's another perspective on it just to describe the same phenomena perhaps through a different lens, which is kind of encapsulated by a heuristic that politics is downstream of culture, effectively. And when you combine that with the idea that memes, not like the little funny images you see on the internet per se, but like memes as a cultural idea that are transmitted from person to person, akin to a virus almost, and viruses can be good or bad depending on exactly what they're doing, that the culture has effectively been overtaken entirely by a bunch of terrible memes about all sorts of things relating to technological progress. So effectively what has happened is we moved from biological evolution to cultural evolution being driven, as you just described, by random variation, which is creating these memes. And the problem is the bad memes are winning and not the good memes. And I view your book actually a good effort in spreading better memes effectively, because I am a massive techno-optimist, like of probably the most radical degree of techno-optimist that exists. And even I did not have a full conception of the actual potential impact on my day-to-day lived experience of increasing humanity's energy production capacity and of the potential concrete, realistic impacts and use cases of nanotechnology. Even the quality of life benefits of having flying cars, as basic as that may sound. Big part of this is also podcasts like this and other things like this, where we can spread better memes effectively to counteract the negative memes that have created a terrifying safetyism egregore about society that is holding back technological progress.
By the way, that Dawkins originated the term meme in reference to gene, which is, it's not so much a virus, but it's just the elements of your genome. The good memes are generally the ones that are what make up what you know and what you have learned in your life and so forth. And they are your inheritance of culture, the same way your genes are your inheritance of biological evolution. Not to be pedantic or anything.
No, I found that always a bit of a point that I was keeping pondering, that even if we're able to unleash a new wave of technological progress, removing some of the obstacles we're facing, get more of that technological progress that we're discussing, what if we are becoming even more like the Eloi, right? And that's kind of the countervailing force, right? Well, people just have too much time. And with the additional free time, you start complaining about things, politicking, virtually signaling with each other. So with more progress, maybe we have more behavior like that.
Well, yes and no. If we don't try to do any more than we're doing now, if we're just trying to have a good life and all sit around by the pool and drink Mai Tais, you're right. We'd be better off if we went back to having to chop the wood by hand and draw water. But we have another option. And the other option is we can take our existing great powers and the new greater powers that lie within our grasp and do greater things. Okay, we have to raise our sights. We have to go out and pick on somebody our own size. We can't just sit around enjoying ourselves and so forth. So as a concomitant with the ability to do more stuff, we have to look for greater goals. One I obviously point out a lot is settling the rest of the solar system, but there are many other things that we could be doing. And I think one of the key tasks of the human race now is to work out just what those things are. But you have a very strong point there. But I think I have an answer to it. It's like, we can't just sit here and do the same old stuff. We're much more capable now, and we're going to be even more so in the future.
Even put the answer a little bit differently as well. I think it also comes down to a lot of people, because a median kind of standard of living, at least in developed countries for now, has reached a point of contentment for many people. And again, culture has done a terrible job of reinforcing this meme, but it's effectively, oh, it's gotten as good as it's going to get, and maybe we'll make a 1% marginal improvement year over year, but maybe not even that, and we should be content with what we have now. People genuinely, and I find this out even talking to fellow techno-optimist friends, do not understand the massive level of quality of life improvement, of the prosperity and well-being of actual people that is still left on the table that we can still reach for. If you even, just to take a nanotech example, which is probably one of my favorites, like if you gain the ability to arbitrarily arrange atoms effectively, which is the end state of nanotechnology in my mind, then you've reached what I like to refer to as post-scarcity. You've literally reached something like the Star Trek materializer thing, where they type a command into a keyboard and out pops whatever it is that they wanted, any object of any kind. Which sounds like utter science fiction, but there are things like that or of that variety, not saying that specifically, that are possible only we were to continue pushing as hard for technological progress and working toward it as a species as we have previously. And then the other issue I think that we haven't raised yet, but I think is an important one, is that human beings, like because of our inherent tribal nature from living on the savannah for hundreds of thousands of years, think of things in neutral sum or negative sum ways. So they think of things like, oh, well, if I get richer, then someone else must necessarily and concomitantly get poorer, which is not at all the case. Like in a free market economy, in the world that we live in, everything is a positive sum game. You can create value for someone else, and they can exchange value for you, and you both end up better off from that value for value exchange. You extrapolate that to innovation, and the world is massively positive sum. So I think just reinforcing these two narratives that, like, A, there's so much prosperity left on the table. There's so much prosperity left on the table, and it is attainable. And B, the world is positive sum. The world is not negative sum. We can build the utopian future that we were promised in sci-fi. It is there and it is achievable if only we would put our collective will toward doing it.
Absolutely. To pick on another little example that is probably coming fairly soon. Robots. I don't know if you ever go out in your garage on Saturday and have some project that you want to do. Suppose I wanted to, instead of building, a new cabinet in the kitchen for my wife, I wanted to build a flying car. It would be nice if I had 100 real intelligent, hardworking servants to help me with it. If that were the case, I could actually probably build a flying car. Thing is, robots. That's coming. That's right there. That's one of the things on the table. You don't, become the peasant in society, the fancy suit and a big house. You become the Lord because you have all these people working for you who A, are good at what they do, and B, do anything you say because they're your robots. And that's a giant step up for the average person to be somebody like that and have that kind of capability, assuming you're the kind of person who wants to accomplish things. So that kind of brings us back to both of the points that we were both talking about there.
Great. I want to raise one last point. One thing that I think can really help us get out of this situation and improve in so many areas is decentralizing innovation. So a lot of innovation has traditionally been very centralized in a couple of concentrations of capital and talent around the world. First and foremost, Silicon Valley. Right. But now with some of the technologies that we have with the internet, we have potentially the ability to do it in other places. Right. So we don't need as much concentration of capital and talent as was required before to make these quantum leaps in technology. What do you think about that? If you agree, what can we do it? What can we add to that thesis? If you disagree, how would that alternative paths to creating more progress look like?
I think, especially in the informational world, that's already pretty much happened. I think that the ability of people to work together. In fact, when I was at Nanorex, we had a geographically distributed, we had guys in California, we had guys in Michigan, we had guys in Pennsylvania, and we were just developing a piece of software, so you could do that. We didn't quite know how to do it as well as we could have done, but that is now something that people know how to do fairly well. The distributed work that became the norm during the COVID was an impetus for that even happening more than it would have. So I think in the information world, that's clearly the case. In the physical world, it sometimes is necessary for people to get together and work on the same machine. Now, if you have robots, it turns out that you can do a lot of that in a distributed way, because you can sort of dial into your robot and work on your thing, or you can dial into my robot and work on my thing. And that's actually a piece of the development of robotics that people don't realize is right there on the development path. And it's going to be A, useful and therefore money making, but also B, enable the next level of robotics. The same way that people doing a lot of reading and writing has enabled the language models that are the leading AI technologies. Because if we have a whole bunch of robots and people dial into them and use them to do things, you're going to have the same body of experience that's necessary to teach these neural nets to do the kind of things that our body of text has allowed them to do in the talkie world. I think that's probably what's really next in robotics is teleoperated machines and people doing, essentially zooming into a robot and doing some job. And ultimately the robots learning from all that and being able to do it themselves.
Josh, you are a huge inspiration to us in Prospera. In a way, many of the things that you describe in your book I frequently had the feeling when I was reading the book, yes, that's why we're doing this. That's why we need this. We're doing gene therapy here. We're having a Bitcoin education center. We're doing decentralized open banking. We want to do a biotech hardware lab here, fractionalized real estate and 3D on the blockchain. Trey could probably also go on and on. Anything else you want to add?
No, I'm just really glad we got to have this conversation. It was fantastic. Like I said, I'm a huge fan, and I hope others use this as a gateway to your work as well. You've been a massive inspiration for us. And like I said, the book, the ideology the book has inspired in me and many others is effectively, there's a future we could have had that isn't here, and we need to build it, full stop. I think we need to encourage more people. So you're spreading the most beneficial meme that I think is out there, and I'm going to continue to do it with you as well. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. You're going to make my head swell so much my earphones won't fit, but that's all I can say.
Yes, let this be a rallying cry for bringing back the future, unleashing a new wave of technological progress, and realize all of the things that we've just been talking about in Prospera, hopefully in more charter cities and startup cities in the future that can be the connective tissue to bring these innovations into the real world and fundamentally change the world of atoms. Josh, it was an epic pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, and not only that, but let me thank you for being the guys who are trying to make it happen. I think you are wonderful, and I just wish there were a lot more people like you.
And thanks to the both of you. I really appreciate it.